For 50 years, Warren Buffett called one industry a trap. Not a bad investment, not a risky bet, a trap. A machine built to swallow money and give nothing back. He said it publicly, over and over, for decades. He mocked the people who bought into it. He warned anyone who would listen to stay far, far away. He even joked, and he meant it, that if a capitalist had been standing at Kitty Hawk when the very first airplane lifted off the ground, the smartest thing that man could have done for the future of investors everywhere would have been to shoot it down. That's how much he hated it. That's how dangerous he thought it was. And then, in front of the entire world, Warren Buffett did the one thing he had spent his whole life swearing he would never do. He walked straight into the trap himself. He didn't dip a toe in. He didn't test the water. He poured billions of dollars into the exact industry he had spent 50 years telling everyone to avoid. The most disciplined investor who ever lived, the man famous for his patience, for never chasing a bad idea, he took the bait, and the whole world watched him do it. So what changed? What could possibly make a man like that break his own oldest rule? And more importantly, what happened next? Because this story does not end the way you think it does. It ends with a phone call, a locked room, and a decision made in a matter of days that erased one of the greatest fortunes ever built in this business. Billions gone. Not slowly, not quietly, all at once. But before we get there, if you love stories where the smartest people in the world make the most human mistakes, where the machinery behind money gets ripped open and laid bare, subscribe right now, because this is one of the strangest, most revealing things Warren Buffett ever did, and almost nobody understands what it actually taught him. Stay with me, it matters. Now. To understand why this was such a shock, you have to understand who Warren Buffett was to the world of money. This is a man who built one of the largest fortunes on earth, not by being clever, not by moving fast, but by being right and being patient. His whole philosophy could fit on a napkin. Find a wonderful business, buy it at a fair price, hold it, quite literally, forever. He didn't gamble, he didn't chase trends. When the entire world was losing its mind over some hot new thing, he would sit perfectly still, look faintly amused, and let it all pass him by. Discipline was his religion, patience was his weapon, and avoiding traps, avoiding the seductive, exciting, money-losing traps that ruined everybody else, that was the entire game. And of all the traps in the world, there was one he hated above all others. One industry he singled out again and again for 50 years as the single clearest example of how to lose money while looking like you're doing something smart. He had a specific word for it. He called it a business with no moat. No protection, no wall around the castle. A business where you could work harder than anyone, fly more people than anyone, and still end up with nothing, because the moment you made $1, a competitor would slash prices and take it right back. He watched it destroy investor after investor, great companies, famous names, brilliant executives, all of them swallowed by the same brutal math. Enormous costs, vicious competition, customers who cared about one thing and one thing only, the lowest possible price. It was, in Buffett's own words, a bottomless pit, a place where fortunes went to die. And he was so certain of this, so burned by it, that he made it a personal law: never again. No matter how good it looks, no matter what anyone says, stay out. So hold that in your mind. Picture this man, the most careful, most disciplined, most trap-avoiding investor who has ever lived. A man who built an empire on the simple, boring, unbreakable rule of never walking into the obvious disaster. A man who, for 50 straight years, pointed at this one industry and said in every way he knew how, "This is the trap. Do not touch it." That's the man, that's the rule. That's 50 years of iron discipline, tested and proven and never once broken. And then one day, quietly, he broke it. He didn't announce it with a grand speech. The news just came out, the way it always does, filed in the cold paperwork, buried in the numbers. Warren Buffett had bought in, not a little, not as an experiment. He had bought into all of them. Every major player in the industry he swore he'd never touch. Billions of dollars poured into the one business he'd spent half a century calling a machine that eats money alive. And the people who had followed him for years, who had memorized his rules, who could recite his warnings by heart, they couldn't believe it. Had he lost it? Had the greatest investor alive finally cracked? Or, and this was the terrifying possibility, did he see something the rest of the world couldn't? Had he found the one reason, the single exception that made the trap worth walking into? There was a reason. There's always a reason with him. And to understand it, we have to go back. Back to a story he told for years about a genius who nearly went broke, and a lesson so painful it should have kept Buffett out of that trap forever. It didn't. The genius Buffett kept talking about wasn't some anonymous cautionary tale. It was one of the most brilliant men in the history of American business. And the reason his story haunted Buffett is simple. This man was proof that being smart, being early, being right about the future, none of it saves you if the business itself is a trap. His name comes up again and again when you dig into how Buffett thinks about airlines, because this was a man who didn't just invest in aviation, he built it. He saw the future of flight before almost anyone. He poured his genius and his fortune into it, convinced, the way everyone always is, that this time it would be different, that the sheer romance of it, the sheer inevitability of air travel, would translate into money. It didn't. The industry chewed him up, not because he was foolish, because the machine doesn't care how smart you are. And that's the lesson that terrified Buffett, the one he repeated for years. Aviation has broken more brilliant people than almost any business on earth. You can be a visionary and still go broke. In fact, being a visionary might make it worse, because you fall in love, and love is exactly what the trap feeds on. So let's actually open up the trap. Let's look inside and understand why this one industry, out of all the industries in the world, became Buffett's personal nightmare. Because once you see the machinery, you'll understand why his warning was so absolute, and why his decision to break his own rule was so shocking. Start with the costs. An airline is one of the most expensive businesses a human being can possibly run. The planes cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. Then you have to fuel them, and fuel prices swing wildly, completely outside your control. One bad year and your profits evaporate. You have to maintain them, obsessively, because a single failure is a catastrophe. You have to staff them with pilots and crews and mechanics and an army of people on the ground. You need gates, you need slots at airports, you need insurance that could fund a small country. The costs are enormous, they are relentless, and most of them never stop, whether your planes are full or completely empty. Now here's the killer. After paying all of that, after the crushing, bottomless expense of just existing, what can you actually charge? What sets you apart from the airline flying the exact same route in the exact same kind of plane at the exact same time? Almost nothing. That's the whole horror of it. To the customer, a seat is a seat. Nobody wakes up loyal to an airline the way they're loyal to their phone, or their favorite drink, or their bank. They wake up loyal to one number, the lowest price. And so the airlines are forced again and again into a war they can never win. A knife fight over pennies, slashing prices to fill seats because an empty seat that takes off is money burned forever. This is what Buffett meant by no moat. A great business has a wall around it, a castle nobody can storm. Think of a company whose product people crave by name, who can raise prices and customers barely blink. That's a moat. That's protection. Airlines have none of it. The castle walls are made of paper. The moment one airline finds a way to profit, 3 others copy it overnight, drop their prices, and the profit vanishes into the same bottomless pit that swallowed everyone before. And it gets worse, because this is a business where the whole industry can be wiped out by things nobody can predict or control. A spike in oil prices, a recession that makes people stop traveling, a storm that grounds every plane in the country for a week, a single act of terror that terrifies the entire flying public overnight, a disease. Airlines sit on top of a fault line, and the ground can open up beneath them at any moment with no warning at all. You can run the tightest, smartest, best managed airline in the world, and a force completely outside your control can still bring you to your knees in a matter of days. Buffett saw all of this. He'd watched it play out for decades. He'd seen the parade of bankruptcies, the famous names that flew high and crashed, the investors who fell in love with the romance of flight and walked away with nothing. He had lived through his own painful brush with it years earlier, a stumble that stung enough to carve the lesson permanently into his mind. And so his conclusion was iron. Airlines are the trap, the clearest, most reliable trap in all of investing. A business that looks essential, feels exciting, seems like it should be a fortune, and quietly destroys almost everyone who touches it. For 50 years that rule held. Through every temptation, every boom, every clever pitch, Buffett stayed out. He watched the industry churn and burn from a safe distance, arms folded, shaking his head at anyone reckless enough to wade in. The trap was for other people, not for him, never for him. Which is exactly why what came next made no sense, because something did change. Slowly, quietly, out of the public's view, the industry that had been a bloodbath for 100 years began to look different. The endless price wars started to cool. The parade of bankruptcies stopped. A handful of survivors emerged from the wreckage, bigger and stronger than anything that came before, and for the first time in living memory, the airlines started doing something they had almost never done. They started making real money, year after year, consistently. And that quiet change, that single crack in a century of misery, was the bait. It was the thing that would eventually pull the most disciplined investor in history off his chair, out of his 50-year rule, and straight toward the one trap he swore he'd never touch. But to understand why the bait worked, you have to understand what these airlines had actually done to survive. Because it wasn't luck. It was something deliberate. Something that on paper looked like it had finally, permanently filled in the bottomless pit. They were wrong. But God, it looked convincing. So what did the airlines actually do? How does an industry that lost money for 100 years suddenly start printing it? The answer is one word, and it's the key to this entire story. Consolidation. For most of aviation history, the sky was a crowded, chaotic mess. Dozens of airlines, all fighting over the same passengers, all undercutting each other into oblivion. It was the knife fight over pennies playing out on a national scale, and it guaranteed that nobody made money for long. Every time one airline raised prices to breathe, a desperate rival dropped theirs to steal the seats, and the whole industry got dragged back down into the pit. But then, slowly, over years, something changed. The weak died. The survivors merged. Airline after airline collapsed or got swallowed, and out of all that wreckage, a small handful of giants emerged. Where there had once been a dozen brawlers, now there were just 4 that really mattered. 4 giants who controlled the skies of an entire nation. And 4 is a very different number than a dozen. 4 companies don't have to fight to the death. 4 companies can look across the table at each other and, without ever saying a word, quietly agree to stop the bleeding, to hold prices steady, to stop flooding the market with empty seats just to spite a rival, to finally act rational. And the moment they did, the money came pouring in. For the first time in living memory, the airlines were disciplined. They kept planes full. They charged for every bag, every seat choice, every little thing. They stopped expanding recklessly. And year after year, they posted profits that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Billions of dollars flowing consistently out of the exact industry that had been a graveyard for a century. Now put yourself in Buffett's chair and watch this happen. For 50 years, he had one reason, one core reason to hate airlines. No moat, no wall, no protection. Anyone could jump in and start a price war. But look at what consolidation had done. When there are only 4 giants, the wall builds itself. It's incredibly hard and expensive for a new airline to break in and challenge them. The 4 survivors sit behind enormous barriers. The planes, the gates, the routes, the sheer scale. And they've learned, painfully, not to attack each other. Do you see it? Do you see the bait? The one thing Buffett had always said airlines could never have, a moat, suddenly appeared to exist. The trap seemed to have been fixed. Not by wishful thinking, by cold, hard consolidation, by the brutal survival of the fittest. The bottomless pit finally seemed to have a floor, and that is a very, very seductive thing for a man like Buffett. Because his entire life's work is finding wonderful businesses protected by moats and buying them at fair prices. For 50 years, airlines failed the first test so completely that he never even got to the second. But now they seem to pass. Now they looked like a small group of dominant, disciplined, cash-generating giants, protected by walls, printing money, and, because everyone still remembered the old horror of aviation, trading cheaply. Undervalued. Unloved. Exactly the kind of thing Buffett spent his whole life hunting. The trap had put on a disguise. And it was the one disguise, out of every disguise in the world, perfectly designed to fool Warren Buffett. It didn't look like a hot new trend. He was immune to those. It looked like a boring, misunderstood, mispriced, high-quality business hiding in plain sight. It looked like everything he loved. And so he did it. He broke the rule. Berkshire Hathaway moved in, and it didn't move in halfway. Buffett didn't pick one airline and test the theory. He bought into all four of the giants. Billions of dollars spread across the entire American sky. The man who joked about shooting down the Wright brothers' plane was now one of the largest airline investors on the planet. The most disciplined investor in history had, for the first time in 50 years, walked directly into the one trap he swore he'd never touch. And he did it not out of recklessness, but out of logic. Cold, careful, convincing logic. And here's what you have to understand. On the surface, the logic was good. This wasn't a mistake made in a moment of madness. This was a reasoned, deliberate bet by one of the smartest financial minds who ever lived, based on a real change in a real industry. The consolidation was real. The profits were real. The discipline was real. For a while, for a genuinely long while, it looked like Buffett had done the impossible. It looked like he'd seen what everyone else missed, spotted the exact moment the graveyard turned into a gold mine, and been rewarded for his nerve. The world of finance took notice. If Buffett was in, maybe the old rules really were dead. Maybe airlines really had changed forever. But somewhere in that logic, buried underneath all that consolidation and discipline and beautiful, convincing math, was a single flaw, one assumption. One thing that every version of the airline is fixed story quietly took for granted. And it was the same flaw, the same fatal blind spot, that had destroyed every genius who ever fell in love with flight. Nobody saw it. Not Buffett, not Wall Street, not the airlines themselves. It sat there, invisible, for years, while the profits rolled in and everyone congratulated themselves for being so clever. And then, without a single word of warning, the ground opened up. For a while, Buffett looked like a genius, again. The airlines kept doing exactly what the story promised. They stayed disciplined. They kept the planes full. They posted their profits, quarter after quarter, and the value of Berkshire's giant bet climbed. The old rule was dead. The graveyard had become a gold mine, and Warren Buffett, the one man brave enough to walk into the trap on cold, careful logic, had been proven right. And this is the moment to stop and say the thing this whole story is really about. Because it's not really about airlines, it's about the trap. For 50 years, Warren Buffett called one industry a trap, a machine built to swallow money and give nothing back. And the terrifying truth, the thing that should keep you up at night if you ever put $1 anywhere, is this. A trap doesn't catch you when it looks like a trap. It catches you when it looks like the smartest thing you've ever done. It catches the careful. It catches the disciplined. It catches the genius who finally, after a lifetime of caution, convinces himself that this time is different. That's what a real trap is. Not a con anyone could spot, but a beautiful, reasonable, well-argued mistake that the smartest person in the room walks into with his eyes wide open, feeling proud of himself the entire way. That's the trap. Hold on to that. Because we're standing right in the middle of it now, and it feels wonderful, and that is exactly the problem. So let's talk about the flaw, the single assumption buried under all that beautiful logic, the one thing that every version of the airlines or fixed story quietly took for granted. Here it is. The entire case rested on one idea, that the good times would keep going, that people would keep flying, that the planes would stay full, the discipline would hold, and the profits would keep rolling in more or less forever. Consolidation had built a wall against competitors, yes, that part was real. But there was one enemy that no wall in the world could ever keep out. One enemy that had been the true killer of airlines all along, the real force behind every bankruptcy, every genius destroyed, every fortune swallowed by the pit, the world itself. Because here is the thing that made airlines uniquely, permanently dangerous, and it never changed. Not with consolidation, not with discipline, not with a single one of the clever fixes. An airline has to fly its planes whether people show up or not. The costs almost never stop. The planes still cost hundreds of millions. The leases still come due. The crews, the gates, the maintenance, the mountains of debt, all of it keeps demanding to be paid every single day, whether the seats are full or empty. In good times, when everyone's flying, that's a money machine. But the second demand disappears, the second the world tells people to stop flying, that same machine flips instantly into a monster. All those costs, all that debt, none of it goes away. But the money coming in, gone, overnight. An airline in a crisis isn't a slow-sinking ship. It's a building on fire. It burns cash so fast that a company sitting on billions can find itself staring at bankruptcy in a matter of weeks. Not years, weeks. That was always the true nature of the beast. Consolidation had made the airlines more profitable than ever, but it had done nothing, absolutely nothing, to change the one fact that mattered most. They were still standing on a fault line. They were still, all four of them, one shock away from catastrophe. And that's the flaw. That's the blind spot buried under all the clever math. Everyone, Buffett, Wall Street, the airlines themselves, had quietly assumed the world would keep cooperating, that nothing would come along big enough, sudden enough, total enough to make people simply stop flying all at once, everywhere, at the same time. Nobody thought it could happen. Because in living memory, it never had. Recessions hurt travel, sure. Terror attacks scared people for a few months. Oil spikes squeezed margins. But a total, global, simultaneous stop? The entire world grounding itself at once? That was unthinkable. That belonged in fiction. It wasn't a risk anyone seriously priced in because there was no example of it in anyone's lifetime. And so the bet sat there, looking brilliant, throwing off profits, while underneath it ran a single, thin assumption that nobody bothered to question, that the unthinkable would stay unthinkable. Buffett was in it deep now, not a toe in the water. Billions spread across all four giants, one of the largest airline positions on Earth. The logic still held, the profits still flowed, the world still cooperated. For years, the trap stayed disguised as the smartest move he'd made in a decade, and there was no reason in sight to think otherwise. But somewhere out in the world, quietly, invisibly, the ground was already beginning to shift. Something was coming that no analyst had in their models, that no airline had planned for, that no wall built by consolidation could ever hope to stop. It didn't care about profits or discipline or moats. It didn't care that Warren Buffett had reasoned his way in so carefully. It was going to do the one thing everyone had assumed was impossible. It was going to make the entire world stop flying, all at once. And when it came, Warren Buffett would have just a matter of days to make the most painful decision of his entire career. In a locked room, on a single phone call, he would have to choose whether to abandon the fortune he'd built on his own broken rule, or go down with it. The clock was already ticking. He just didn't know it yet. It started as a headline you could ignore, a story from somewhere far away, the kind of thing that scrolls past while you're thinking about something else. Then it was on every front page. Then it was everywhere. And then, faster than anyone believed possible, the world simply stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Borders slammed shut. Cities went silent. Entire countries told their people to stay inside their homes and not come out. And in the middle of it all, right at the very center of the blast, sat the airlines. Because when the world is told to stay home, the first thing that dies, instantly and completely, is flying. Nobody was going on vacation. Nobody was flying to a meeting. Nobody was going anywhere. The demand that the entire industry depended on didn't shrink. It didn't dip. It vanished. Almost overnight, it fell off a cliff toward zero. Go and picture what that actually looked like, because it was one of the strangest sights of the modern age. Airports, those roaring, sleepless machines that never go quiet, fell silent. And the planes? Thousands upon thousands of them, hundreds of millions of dollars each, rolled off the runways and parked. Wing to wing, nose to tail, in long metal rows stretching across the desert, across spare runways, across any patch of concrete big enough to hold them. Grounded. All of them. The great fleets of the mightiest airlines on Earth, sitting still under an empty sky. It was the unthinkable made real. The exact scenario that no analyst had in their models, that no wall of consolidation could stop, that everyone had quietly assumed could never ever happen, happening, all at once, everywhere. And the moment it did, the beautiful logic detonated. Remember what an airline truly is. Remember the flaw. The costs never stop. Those thousands of grounded planes weren't free just because they weren't flying. They were bleeding money by the minute. The leases still came due. The debt still demanded to be paid. The maintenance, the parking, the skeleton crews, the mountain of fixed costs, all of it kept right on burning every single day while not $1 came in the door. The money machine had flipped, exactly as the flaw predicted, into a monster. Companies that had been posting record profits just weeks earlier were suddenly staring at the abyss. The building was on fire, and it wasn't going to burn for years. It was going to burn in weeks. The airlines were, quite literally, some of the hardest hit businesses on the entire planet. Not damaged, not struggling, facing extinction. The very thing that had made them so profitable in the good times, all those planes, all that scale, all that leverage, became the thing that could destroy them fastest in the bad. And there was no bottom in sight, because nobody knew when the world would open again. A week? A year? 2 years? Would people even want to get on a plane again after all this? Nobody knew anything. And nobody knows anything is the single most dangerous phrase in all of investing. Now, Warren Buffett. The most disciplined investor who ever lived, sitting on billions of dollars spread across all 4 of the giants. The man who had reasoned his way so carefully into the one trap he swore he'd never touch. Watch what happens to his position. The value of his airline bet didn't just fall, it collapsed. Day after day, the numbers cratered, and there was no floor, because the thing driving the crash wasn't a business problem he could analyze. It was the entire world grinding to a halt on a timeline nobody could predict. And here is where the story turns into something more than money. Because Buffett now had to make a decision, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the most painful decisions of his entire life. Everything he was, everything he'd built his reputation on for 60 years, was screaming 2 opposite things at once. One voice, his oldest, deepest instinct, said hold. That was his religion. Buy wonderful businesses and hold them forever. Never panic. Never sell in a crash. When everyone else is terrified, that's exactly when you stay calm and stay in. He had made his entire fortune by refusing to flinch when the world lost its mind. Hold. Write it out. Be brave. Be patient. Be Buffett. But the other voice, the cold, honest, analytical voice that was the real engine of his genius, was saying something he did not want to hear. It was saying, you were wrong. Not wrong to be patient, wrong about the thing underneath, wrong about the assumption. The whole reason to be in airlines was that they'd finally become predictable, protected, safe enough. And this global grounding, this total collapse, was living proof that they were never safe, that the flaw was real, that the fault line had always been there, and now the ground had opened, and the world he'd bet on had ceased to exist. The situation had fundamentally changed, and to Warren Buffett, that phrase means everything, because his rule was never really hold forever no matter what. His rule was hold a wonderful business forever, as long as the reasons you bought it are still true. And the reasons he'd bought the airlines, the discipline, the predictability, the moat that finally seemed real, had just been proven false in the most brutal way imaginable in a matter of days. So he went quiet. He pulled his team together, and behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the panic and the noise of a world falling apart, Warren Buffett sat down to do the one thing every follower he had would have sworn was impossible. He was going to break his own rule. Again. Only this time in the opposite direction, and it was going to cost billions. The decision, when it came, was total. Buffett didn't trim the position. He didn't sell one airline and keep the others. He didn't wait for a bounce or hedge or hope. He sold all of it, every share, in all four giants, the entire position, billions of dollars, built up carefully over years, the boldest reversal of his own thinking in half a century, gone, liquidated, out. In the middle of the crash, at some of the worst prices imaginable, Warren Buffett walked away from the whole thing and took the loss. And then he did something even harder than selling. He stood up in front of the world and told everyone he'd been wrong. This is the part that people still can't quite believe. Buffett didn't hide it. He didn't spin it. He didn't bury it in a footnote or blame the world or pretend it was somebody else's call. He said it plainly, in public, for everyone to hear. I made a mistake. I bought into the airline business, and it turned out to be the wrong decision. One of the richest, most respected, most successful investors who ever lived, standing in front of millions of people, admitting that he had walked into the exact trap he spent 50 years warning everyone else about, and gotten burned. Think about how much that costs a man. Not the money, the pride. Buffett's entire brand, his whole legend, is built on being the one who doesn't get fooled, the patient one, the disciplined one, the man who stays calm while everyone else loses their head. And here he was, confessing that he'd broken his own oldest rule, been seduced by the one disguise built to fool him, and paid for it in billions. He could have stayed quiet. He could have let it slip by unnoticed in the chaos of a world falling apart. Instead, he put it on the table and owned it completely. Now, here's the question that matters, the question this entire story has been building toward. Was this a defeat? Was this the moment the great Warren Buffett finally got beaten, finally lost his edge, finally proved he was just as fallible as everyone else? No. And understanding why is the single most valuable thing you will take from all of this. Because selling those airlines wasn't panic. It looked like panic. To a casual eye, it looked like the old man losing his nerve, dumping stocks at the bottom, doing the exact opposite of everything he ever preached about staying calm in a crash. But it was the opposite of panic. It was the coldest, clearest, most disciplined act in the entire story. Panic is selling because you're scared and the numbers are red. Discipline is selling because the reason you bought is no longer true. And that's the whole difference. Buffett didn't sell because the price dropped. He had ridden out 100 price drops in his life without flinching. He sold because the world had proven in a matter of days that the one thing he needed to believe about airlines simply wasn't real. He'd bought them believing they'd finally become safe, predictable, protected. The grounding of the entire global fleet was undeniable proof that they were none of those things, that the fault line had been there all along and would always be there, no matter how much consolidation or discipline you stacked on top of it. So the facts changed, and when the facts change, you change. That was never weakness. That was the exact opposite of the thing that destroys most investors. Most people, when they're wrong, cling. They double down. They fall in love with a losing position and go down with the ship, protecting their ego all the way to zero. Buffett did the one thing that ego makes almost impossible. He admitted the truth, cut the position, took the pain, and walked away with his judgment intact. He'd rather take a real, brutal, public loss today than pretend and lose everything tomorrow. Because here's the terrible irony that makes this whole story matter. If he had done the brave thing, if he'd held on, gritted his teeth, stayed loyal to his own bet the way his followers begged him to, he might have ridden that position straight down into something far worse. The airlines survived, but only barely, and only because they were rescued from the outside and forced to pile on staggering new debt to stay alive. They came out the other side weaker, more fragile, more diluted. The bet he'd made was broken the day the world stopped, and no amount of stubbornness would have unbroken it. So the loss was real, the billions were real, the public humiliation was real, but the discipline underneath it was the same discipline that made him a legend in the first place. He'd broken his rule to get in, and then he'd broken it again to get out. And both times he was following a rule far deeper than any of them, the only rule that ever really mattered. Which brings us finally to the thing this was all about. Not airlines, not one crisis, not even one man's billion-dollar mistake. Something bigger. Something that reaches straight off the screen and into every single decision you will ever make with your own money, your own risks, your own life. Because if the most disciplined investor who ever lived, a man who studied this exact trap for 50 years and warned the whole world about it, could still get pulled in, still get burned, still have to stand up and admit he was wrong, then the real lesson isn't about him at all. It's about you. So here's the truth this whole story leaves on your doorstep, and it's not comfortable. The trap did not fail because Warren Buffett was foolish. It worked because he was brilliant. Read that again, because it's the entire lesson. The trap didn't beat the careless. It beat the single most careful investor who ever lived. It didn't win with a wild trend or an obvious scam, the kind of thing you or I might laugh at. It won by disguising itself as the smartest, most reasonable, most disciplined decision on the table. It studied the one man on earth best equipped to see it coming, and then it built the exact costume designed to fool him. Boring, undervalued, misunderstood, protected, everything he loved. And he walked in with his eyes wide open, feeling proud the entire way. That is what a real trap is. Not the thing that looks dangerous, the thing that looks like your best idea. And now sit with what that means for you. Because you are not Warren Buffett. You don't have 60 years of scars, or a team of the sharpest minds in finance, or the discipline to admit a public mistake and cut billions loose in a single move without your ego dragging you down with it. If the trap could catch him with all of that, then somewhere out there is a version of it built precisely for you. It won't feel like a gamble. It will feel like the one smart thing everybody else is too blind to see. It will feel like your edge. That feeling, that quiet certainty that this time really is different, is not the sound of you being clever. Sometimes it's the sound of the trap closing. So what do you actually do with that? You don't stop taking risks. The answer isn't fear. The answer is the exact thing that saved Buffett in the end. The rule underneath all his other rules, the only one that ever really mattered. Know why you're in, and the moment that reason stops being true, get out. That's it. That's the whole thing. He didn't buy those airlines on a whim, and he didn't sell them in a panic. He bought them for a specific reason, and he sold them the instant the world proved that reason was dead. Not when the price dropped, not when he was scared. When the fact changed. Most people do the opposite of this, and it ruins them. They forget why they got in. They fall in love. They confuse loyalty to a decision with strength when it's really just ego wearing a brave face. And they ride a broken bet all the way to the bottom, protecting their pride, telling themselves that holding on is the courageous thing, right up until there's nothing left to hold. The courageous thing is not never being wrong. Nobody gets that. Buffett didn't get that. The courageous thing is being able to look at the truth, say the words, "I was wrong," and act on them today, while the loss is still survivable, instead of pretending and losing everything tomorrow. He'd rather take the real, brutal, public pain now than the fantasy of being right later. In that single trade, the willingness to lose money to keep his judgment is the whole reason he had a fortune worth risking in the first place. So no, this was never really a story about airlines. It was never even a story about a billion-dollar mistake. It's a story about a trap that only springs when you're certain you've outsmarted it, and about the one discipline that lets you escape, even after you've walked all the way in. Buffett broke his rule to get in. He broke it again to get out. And both times he was obeying the deepest rule of all. The truth doesn't care what you already decided. So when the truth changes, you change with it, no matter what it costs your pride. Which leaves one last question, the only one that matters now. The lights are off. It's you, alone, and every risk you're holding right now. Every bet, every plan, every position you've quietly fallen in love with. Do you still know why you're in it? And if the reason died tomorrow, would you have the discipline to walk away? Or would you go down with it, telling yourself you were being brave? Because that trap, the one dressed up as your smartest move, it isn't waiting somewhere out in the future. It's already in the room. It always was. The only thing that decides whether it closes on you is whether you're honest enough to see it when it's wearing the one disguise you'd never suspect. Warren Buffett saw his, late at a brutal cost in front of the whole world, but he saw it. The real question is whether you'll see yours. If this changed the way you look at your own decisions, even a little, then don't let it be the last one. This is exactly what this channel does. It takes the biggest stories in money and pulls out the one lesson that actually protects you. Subscribe and stay, because the next trap is already being built, and the only edge you get is seeing it coming before it wears a face you trust.